There's a visible U.S. focus on wooing African countries as it looks to counter growing Chinese presence on the continent. That's exactly what comes through in a recent flurry of high-level U.S. visits to Africa amid a tug of war of influence between two rival powers. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is expected to travel to Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia later this month. These are notably the three countries with the highest levels of borrowing from China. Harris's trip will make her the highest-ranking official in the Biden administration to visit the continent, and she's not the only one. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also visiting Ethiopia and Niger this month, where, according to the U.S. State Department, will discuss the implementation of the agreement to advance peace and promote justice in northern Tigray and Ethiopia. This will be his second visit to Africa in 2 months. Then there are Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield, and U.S. First Lady Jill Biden, who've already visited recently. Jill Biden's trip focused more than diplomacy. She visited places in East Africa hit by drought and met some Maasai women in the region. She also appealed to other nations to join the United States to end their suffering. All these visits, diplomatic ties, and calls for human aid come down to one main point, and that's an intense competition between China and the United States over their presence on the continent in terms of economy and the military. The fact remains that China is way ahead of the U.S. when it comes to economic ties with African nations. But at the same time, the U.S. is leading the race when it comes to military presence. Beijing has only one military base on the continent in Djibouti, while the U.S. has more than 10 sites where some 6,000 soldiers are deployed. At stake also is access to Africa's huge mineral resources, on which a large part of their respective industry does depend on. Okay, well, for more on this and to get to the heart of the matter, we are joined by James Schwemlein, non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a global think tank. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. James, welcome back to WION. Thank you for joining us. This tug of war in Africa between the United States and China has been ongoing for years. However, with ties really, with relations between China and the United States not at a good place, to say the least, right now, how significant is this trip by Kamala Harris to the continent at this point?
Yeah, I think, and it's nice to talk to you again, Susan. I think Vice President Harris's visit to Africa, as you described, is an important piece of a broader puzzle that the Biden administration is pursuing in terms of its engagement. That the entire initiative was described in December when President Biden hosted 37 heads of state and representatives of all of the African Union countries in Washington. But I think one element of it that we'll focus on, and I think the administration has made a mistake in focusing on, is in framing its engagement against China or about strategic competition with China, and not just about U.S.-Africa bilateral ties.
Do you think the United States has been reacting to Chinese measures in recent years as opposed to taking a proactive measure on the international stage? In Africa at this point, it seems like it's following China's lead in some way. Would you agree with that, or is that a misconception?
I think we have to separate the security domain from the commercial domain, from business. In the business domain, the U.S. government doesn't lead the agenda. I think it's one of the misconceptions, and it's one of the areas where China has a very different approach, where the U.S. and Chinese approaches are distinct. There's no question that China, as a matter of government policy, has put a greater priority on investment in Africa than the U.S. government. However, I think there is a large and growing U.S. commercial focus on Africa that is private sector led, that is led bottom up, and it, frankly, I think is a a commercial, there is a commercial competition in Africa. It just doesn't happen to be between the U.S. government, which isn't really a commercial entity, and the Chinese government, which very much, does manipulate markets.